other than that sort of work was Johnnie Cochran, who in the early 90s and late 80s was doing all sorts of work, wonderful work, that I think to a certain degree became obscured by his work on the O.J. Simpson case. And I consider Johnnie a very close friend. We co-hosted a show together, and you know, I often felt that he too didn't get sometimes enough credit for the amount of work that he did for free for causes that he cared about. Let me speak broadly a little bit first before I talk about the Michael Jackson case and before I talk about some of the things that Tom was saying. The question that I get asked most often is, do I think celebrities get a different kind of justice in this country? Put aside race for a moment. Do celebrities get, do juries tend to like celebrities and as a result treat them better? Because people say, oh, it seems that any time a celebrity's on trial, they're getting off. From Robert Blake to O.J. to Michael Jackson, you name it, people say, they seem to be walking free. And the answer that I give in response to that is that I don't really think it's as much about the jurors saying, oh, there's a celebrity and I'm not going to convict that person, as I do think that they actually evaluate the evidence more carefully than they do in an ordinary case. In an ordinary, everyday murder case, where there isn't a great attorney representing the person, where they don't feel that they're being scrutinized as closely, I don't think that they really do apply the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. I don't think that they look at the evidence as critically as they do in high-profile cases. Now, I think Tom is right to a certain degree that it does become something of a technicality when you say, beyond a reasonable doubt versus preponderance of the evidence, etc. But if you look at it from a slightly broader perspective, I think that jurors in high-profile cases do examine the evidence more closely because they know that the world is watching. And I think that you see verdicts that you might not ordinarily see in an everyday case. And depending on how you look at the system, that's either a good or bad thing. If you want to see, you know, if you think that 10 guilty people should go free in order to protect one innocent person, then that's exactly what you're seeing in high-profile cases. It's just depending on your perspective on how you look at trials. With regard to the Jackson case specifically, let me talk first about the media coverage. Both the prosecution and the defense in this case spent a lot of time attacking the media. You're hearing Tom talk about how horrible the media coverage was, but I will tell you as an observer that I think that Michael Jackson got a fairer shake in the media than just about any other high-profile defendant I've seen. Geraldo Rivera saying he's going to shave his mustache if Michael Jackson is convicted because this is definitely a shakedown. You don't generally get someone with Geraldo's profile saying that he's going to shave his mustache if a particular defendant is convicted because he's that sure that the person is not guilty. Look, I was on the, and there is a difference, and I think it's important to distinguish between opinion-based programming and straight newscasts. And I've done both. I'm now doing an opinion-based program. I admit it. I tell people what I'm thinking each day. I think there's something refreshing and honest about that. Tom refers to people who do that as sort of non-professional. I would say it's actually the most professional thing you can do, which is to come forward and say, look, here's what I'm thinking. You can now take that opinion and decide for yourself what you think about how I'm perceiving the case. I think it's a lot more dangerous when people don't admit how they feel about things up front. And there are certain people who covered this case who opposed Tom's view on this case, who I think were dishonest about their views, who pretended to be fair and straight across and never have an opinion one way or the other. Oh, I'm just saying, I'm just telling you, here's what he said in court, and they're being dishonest because they're not giving you the context. And I think as long as you provide context, you can offer opinion-based programming that can be professional and can be honest. And look, I started this case believing that Michael Jackson would not be convicted. I said it on my program. I thought that this was a family with too many problems, that a jury just couldn't believe beyond a reasonable doubt the testimony of this family. That's how I came into the case, told my viewers that. I said, look, here's what I'm seeing so far, but let's see what we get as the case proceeds. And again, I think that Tom deserves a lot of credit for what he was able to do with the evidence. But with that said, I think that a lot of the evidence worked against Tom. And what I thought by the end of the case was that the jurors wouldn't look just at the evidence in this case. I thought that they would say the evidence that Michael Jackson had molested another boy or other boys was compelling enough that we can't let him walk out the door. That wouldn't have been the proper way to look at it. Wouldn't have been applying the instructions that the judge gave them. But I, like Tom, also believe that you can't always assume that jurors are going to abide by each and every one of these technical instructions that they get in how to look at a case. And so by the end of the case, and I'm not going to get as detailed into it as Tom did about the various pieces of evidence, etc., but I'll just tell you, by the end of the case, and I'll read you, because I brought a couple of these statements that I made about the case. At the end of the case, Tom's right. I got it wrong. I said that I'm starting to question whether Michael Jackson will be able to leave this courthouse a free man. Before the case started, I predicted he would likely be acquitted or there'd be a hung jury. But now the evidence is in. I've listened to the closing arguments. I have to say I'm leaning towards just the opposite outcome, a hung jury or a conviction on at least one of the more serious charges against him. Why? Because the prosecution had made out a pretty compelling case that Michael Jackson molested another child, one of the other children. And I said, regardless of the specific law, if these jurors are convinced he's a child molester, I think they'll figure out a way to convict him. The defense's closing just glossed over the allegations from other boys, merely saying that Jackson may have been naive or immature, that he may have had problems with his personal life, that they didn't specifically address those allegations. I said that that could be trouble, that Jackson says his bedroom at Neverland was just an innocent place for the kids to enjoy milk and cookies, a bedtime story. But the defense never explained why this innocent childlike man had all these porn magazines with books and naked boys in the bedroom. The prosecutors, I said, were fairly convincing when they pointed out that Jackson's only long-term relationships were with children who often slept in his bed, not just for a night or two, but one boy for a full year. And the tape the prosecution played, the accuser first after telling authorities about the alleged abuse, pretty powerful. I hadn't seen it before, and either that boy was reluctantly telling a difficult story about abuse, or he was and has a bigger future in Hollywood than his mother thought. I said this mother has major issues when it comes to her credibility, and if this case comes down to her, Jackson will walk, period. And that's still a possibility. But prosecutors were smart to point out that she was not the brightest bulb, but still could have pulled off this massive conspiracy to bring an international celebrity down without first asking for money. I said this is the closest call I've seen yet in a high-profile case, but it's a stronger case than I thought. I have no problem admitting that I was wrong about that. I did view this as a very close case going to trial. And I, again, think that's why the defense team deserves so much credit. But in the end, do I think this was the right verdict? Yes. I think that there was not enough evidence to believe that, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Michael Jackson molested this boy and served him alcohol with the intent to molest him. The conspiracy charge was based primarily on the testimony of the boy's mother, whose credibility was simply decimated. But I don't think that it means that Jackson's been vindicated. It doesn't mean that he's just the gentle, terrific guy that Tom is portraying. Misunderstood and targeted. I think that he spent far too many nights in beds with boys alone to believe that. I think he's paid too many millions of dollars to settle claims to accept that. The stories of the boys were often too consistent. The boys looked too similar. His bedroom, filled with a sort of smut, a milk and cookies loving Peter Pan-like figure, would either ignore or abhor. I'm reading in part from something that I said at the end of the case, and that I thought that the jurors might dislike Jackson enough to convict him, but they didn't do that. It doesn't mean that the result is a moral one, but it wasn't the question the jurors were asked to answer. And I think on the specific question the jurors were asked to answer, that they answered it in the only way that they could. Let me make a final point about media coverage of these cases. I think actually in most cases in those of us who admit that we are, and again, when I express an opinion, I'm not rooting for one side or another. I mean, I don't feel like I have a stake in the outcome. I don't mind if my reasoning is sound for offering up an opinion about what's going to happen. I don't feel ashamed to come and say, I didn't have to bring in these statements of myself, admitting to you that I didn't get it right. I'm perfectly comfortable, as long as I view my reasoning as sound, and my ability to relay the facts is accurate. I did that throughout this case. And again, when I was reporting strictly for the newscasts, for example, in the O.J. Simpson case, I was not involved in an opinion-based show. I was strictly reporting what was in court. And despite the fact that we went to great lengths to be as objective as possible, and I think that in cases like the O.J. Simpson case, objectivity can actually be a bias in and of itself. We can talk about that if you have any questions later. But I think that there are certain times where certain pieces of evidence, there is a right and a wrong. And as a reporter who wasn't allowed to take a position, I couldn't differentiate between the two. I had to basically say, the prosecution says this, but keep in mind the defense argues this, or the defense is saying this, but remember the prosecution argues that. And even when we would do that, of course, O.J. Simpson claimed again and again that the media coverage was unfair. The problem that O.J. Simpson had, in my opinion, was the evidence. It wasn't the way it was being reported, it was the fact that it was being reported. And it is such an easy scapegoat in all these cases to blame the media. Every single high-profile trial, you will hear attorneys blaming the media on both sides. Oh, so unfair. And in the Jackson case, it was almost humorous to hear both sides saying it was the media's fault. And I would say, and in response to Tom's attack on the media, I would say the only people who I think should have less credibility than lawyers on TV are lawyers who are paid to take a position. The notion that somehow someone member of the media who, let's assume they have a bias, let's assume that they're too opinionated, that person is less credible than someone who's being paid to advocate for someone is an absurdity. But I love Tom Mesereau. He is, I do. This is the response that I believe applies in response not specifically to Tom as much to attorneys who try and undermine the credibility of the media. And let me say that Tom is right. We do have different goals than the legal system. And it does create a tension. There's no doubt about it. Journalists have a different goal than the legal system, and it frustrates lawyers that we can't play by the legal rules. For example, hearsay evidence. We report it all the time. Lawyers would love for us to just report what comes into evidence and not report anything beyond what's in evidence because they're concerned that it's going to unfairly impact their client's right to a fair trial. Okay, I understand that. That's generally what jury selection is for smart lawyers to get up there and be able to ascertain